كنت أنا مروح من المدرسة، كان في قريب من المدرسة مظاهرات، كان في المسيرة قنابل غاز مسيل للدموع وضرب رصاص، فكنت أجري بدي أهرب منهم، وهناك ضربة رصاصة حي في ركبتي ولحظتها وقعت على وجهي. هسا ما لفيتش وجهي إلا وأنا بلاقي جندي إسرائيلي ضربني بالبارودة على عيني. أجا جنود وبلشوا في الضرب المبرح. الجندي شاف إني متصاب في رجلي، قاعد يكبس عليها ويدوس عليها لدرجة إني تمنيت الموت في هذيك اللحظة من شدة الوجع. دخلوني للتحقيق وبلش معي بأسلوب التهديد والقوة، فأكون قاعد قباله على الطاولة يرفع علي السلاح ويقول لي إن ما اعترفت بطخ. من شدة الضرب والتهديد تضطر إنك تحكي بس عشان الله يبعده عنك.
Thank you, Diana. So I started, hi everyone. I'm Lana again, speaking to you from Palestine, from Save the Children's Country Office in the OPT. I started this presentation with this video because it more or less summarizes the journey children go through, from the moment to arrest to like transfer, interrogation, and then doesn't show more, but like it actually summarizes a lot of the ill treatment that happens. And before I just start with this kind of overview, I also want to share, like, because not everyone experiences the same experience like Hassan, the one we've seen in the video. Others have different also experiences. So I'll share just another really short story about another child. His name is Ahmad. Ahmed is a young boy I've met a few weeks ago, and he told me when he was arrested for the first time when he was 13. He told me it was after midnight when many soldiers broke into his home, searched it while destroying his family's belongings. He told me that his mother tried to reach out to hug him, but soldiers pushed her to the side. Ahmed thought of this hug every day during his detention period. So this is just for you to hear also what children say and how they feel about these kind of experiences. As you see in the slide, so every year around 500 to 700 Palestinian children come into contact with the Israeli military court system. In fact, while I'm speaking now, there are around 160 Palestinian children in detention. The majority of them are charged, but they're still waiting for their trial because they haven't been sentenced yet. Israel is the only country in the whole world where that actually systematically prosecutes children in military courts. And the most common charge that children face is throwing stones, which has a really high maximum penalty. The maximum penalty is 20 years. So 20 years isn't applied all the time, but it gives them the chance to give higher sentences for children for throwing stones. The law enforcement system in Israel treats Palestinian children as guilty until proven innocent. For example, the majority of children maintain their innocence, but eventually they end up entering a guilty plea in order to reduce their sentence. And this is why one of the probably the reasons why there is a really, really high conviction rate. One last point for you to know, generally speaking, many children detainees are transferred from the occupied territory, from Palestine to Israeli territory. There are a few prisons and only one of them is actually in the West Bank, and children are detained in. The other two are in Israeli territory, which is a violation of international law. Next slide, please. As you've seen from the video and the opening slide, there is significant evidence of ill treatment of children who come into contact with the Israeli military detention. And such evidence comes from so many research done from like lawyers, organizations, including DCI, B'Tselem, and others. However, there has been less research conducted on the broader impact of detention on children's lives, including their mental and physical health, their relationships, place in society, and future prospects. So in light of this, we've decided to conduct research with the former child detainees across the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, using both qualitative and quantitative methodology. We've produced our first report, Defenceless, in November 2020, and we're currently in the process of launching another report, which specifically studies the impact of family separation on child detainees and their families. Next slide. So children were asked to describe their journey through the detention system, from the time of arrest through transfer, interrogation, detention, and then attempts to reintegrate back in their society. Nearly all children said that they've experienced ill treatment at some stage in this process, including widespread use of solitary confinement, physical emotional violence, coercive interrogations, and denial of due process rights. Like Ahmed and Hassan, like Ahmed, the one I've spoken about in the beginning, more than half of the children arrested were arrested from their home during night raids, and that would be between the hours of midnight and dawn. So another child, Abdullah, for example, he told me soldiers destroyed the main door, entered my room, covered my face with a bag, and took me. They forced the rest of my family members into one room while they arrested me. They told my father that I will return tomorrow. I returned after 12 months. Also, during focus group discussions with children, it emerged that the shock of being woken up and arrested at night compounded with the stress suffered during transfer and interrogation. So children felt disoriented, confused, and exhausted. Children who were arrested at night are more likely to face sleeping disorders or problems, insomnia, long after they have been released from prison. Many children who were arrested at night said they weren't allowed to sleep before they began their interrogations with the officers, the Israeli officers. Not only the children are woken up and arrested in the middle of the night, almost all children told us that their hands were tied behind their back with plastic ties, even though in 2010, Israeli regulations changed in paper and said that children will have their hands tied if necessary in front of them, but that according to the research didn't happen. And also the majority were blindfolded or hooded. Next slide, please. And from the very beginning of this experience, when the arrest actually happens, children show how being separated from their families has great impact on them. The vast majority of children were, again, detained without being summoned in advance in the middle of the night. This highly distressing experience resulted in most children reporting feeling unsafe, anxious, afraid. 66% of the children also reported that these distressing experiences during the arrest resulted in them feeling guilt that they exposed their family to danger, or that they caused harm to their families, and that their parents cannot protect them. Like Khalid, for example, who's just 15 years old, he said, "You can't help but feel bad about what you are putting your parents through. When I was detained, sadness took over our home. My parents slept in my room, missing me and feeling sad that we were apart." Next slide, please. Children are commonly transferred. So after the arrest, they're commonly transferred between various detention facilities and interrogation centers. And the trip can last for many hours. Children reported being handcuffed with metal chairs, first to lie face down on the metal floors of the military vehicles, or strip searched, denied bathroom breaks, denied food and water, physically assaulted during these transfers. And then after the transfers, they usually go through interrogations. And interrogations, they're different from a child to the other in terms of length, but in general, when children described a coercive and intimidating environment, which, as you can see in the slide, 52% were threatened with harm to their family. 89% reported experiencing verbal abuse, 86 reported being strip searched, and 56 were held in solitary confinement. Many children encountered being asked to sign documents that they did not understand, as they were written in Hebrew. Children would not have a lawyer or a parent present during their interrogation sessions. They're not reminded of their rights, and they're pressured to incriminate themselves or others. Like Sami, a child who told us that interrogators wanted him to confess to a crime that he didn't commit. They wanted to put pressure on him so that he could confess false crimes about his friends as well. This often happens under the threat of violence to the children themselves, to family members. Sometimes the threat would be even of harsher punishments. And none of those children we've consulted told us that their interrogations was recorded. As you've seen in the slide, our research shows that more than half of the children were held in solitary confinement, even though under no circumstances whatsoever a child should be held in solitary confinement. I mean, I remember in fall 2020, when I spoke to Zaid, who was held in solitary confinement for around 40 days, he didn't see anyone during this whole period, but interrogators and prison guards. Not only was Zaid scared, anxious, and alone, he was then diagnosed with COVID-19 less than a week after his release from solitary confinement, so forced to self-isolate again. It was so difficult for him to speak. He was so scared, didn't want to see or speak to anyone. I remember talking to his counselor, who was also with us when we met him. All he was thinking of is his fear of being arrested again. Next slide, please. So during the detention itself as well, the experience is also bears many other difficulties, and how children described the detention, I mean, the words they've used is torturous. One of the most difficult experiences a person can endure. Dehumanizing, humiliating, confusing. You can see that the ill treatment is not limited to physical or emotional abuse during arrest, transfer, interrogations, but it also is the denial of services. I mean, children can even less likely to receive health care than receive legal services while in detention, with an overwhelming 88% reporting that they did not receive the health care they've needed. And for the small minority that actually received health care, children said that it was not appropriate or timely treatment. Also, more than half of the children were not allowed to see their families while they were detained. Most of them reported feelings of fear, isolation, depression. And one of the most common, frequent reported practices by the Israeli authorities was emphasizing to children that they are alone, abandoned by their family, friends, and society. Children recalled that prison guards would falsely tell them that their families were refusing to visit them, making them feel abandoned and isolated. Next slide. So despite the Israeli prison services regulations that state that children are entitled to have family visits every 2 weeks, obviously, consultations with children and families show that this does not happen in reality. Children reported long periods of time, weeks, months passing before they were able to contact their parents, whether on the phone or in person. 17-year-old Salim explained to us saying, "I felt sad whenever I heard good or bad news related to my family. I couldn't be part of it." Another child told us that he knew that his sister was going to have her wedding while he was in detention. And he was so sad that he couldn't participate. So he asked other detained children to dance with him that day. Some children can serve their entire sentence without seeing their families at all. Next slide, please. So unsurprisingly, these experiences make a massive toll on children's health, both mental and physical. Children said that the experiences of impacts, they experience the impact of detention more explicitly when they attempt to reintegrate back in their families and lives and society generally. The majority of the children reported that they do not feel safe outside their home after their release, or cannot express their emotions and feelings, or they experience insomnia and some difficulty sleeping, among like other things. Some children, and actually a lot of them, said that they have changed forever due to this experience. Like Noor, like I met Noor around a month ago, and she kept on telling me that she completely changed after her arrest. Noor was arrested when she was 15 years old, along with her younger sister, who was 13 years old. They were arrested in the middle of the night, woken up from their home, and they were kept in solitary confinement, each in a separate cell. Noor told me how she had never slept outside her home or even in a room by herself until that first night in solitary confinement. She told me how scared she was, how all she could think of is her younger sister alone in a cell somewhere. She felt responsible to protect her, but she told me she couldn't do anything. After her release, she said she suffered so many difficulties, including difficulty sleeping, had constant nightmares, felt isolated from her friends in specific, but also family. She was scared and anxious whenever she would hear any unexpected sound, thinking that it's soldiers coming back to arrest her again. So with their sense of like security shaken, one can only imagine the profound repercussions on children's mental and physical health, which can manifest in physical symptoms as well, such as uncontrollable shaking, excessive crying, chest pains as well. But also one of the most reported barriers that child detainees face when trying to overcome all of these like symptoms and traumatic experiences is how widespread the practice of child detainees is. So one boy, Bilal, described his challenges at moving past his time in prison at the age of 14 by telling us, I remember the details. I try not to think about them, but it's impossible because every time a child is arrested, I remember my own experience. So while former detainees are trying to move from their experiences, many actually re-experience their detention when they witness or hear about other children being detained. This only worsens this feeling of nowhere is safe. But also like the continuous presence of Israeli soldiers all across the West Bank is a trigger for children. Not only for the traumatic memories of detention themselves, but also reminding children that their safety continues to be at the center of the policies of the occupation. For example, Omar is 14 years old. He lives in one of the refugee camps, and he told us, when an Israeli Jeep army enters the camp, I get anxious and afraid that they are coming to arrest me again. So this, again, constant reminder, like another child, Fatma, who got arrested from a checkpoint going to her school. Now, again, she tells us every time she goes to school, crosses the checkpoint, she's anxious and afraid, reminded of the experience, but also scared that she'll be arrested again. Next slide, please. But still, These traumatic experiences that many children face in detention have not deemed their hope for the future or determination to have a productive and fulfilling life. Many strongly care about their future and are determined to make the right decisions in their lives. Children actually still feel joy and a sense of accomplishment when they succeed in school or work. Mais, a former child detainee, told us, despite the circumstances, I must continue to study because it is a tool which makes girls stronger and give us more important place in society. And another former child detainee, Amir, also told us that we have the right to continue our education or to work in any field we want, and we can do it. Not every former child detainee needs to work in construction sites. So also children do show their needs and determination for a better future. Next slide, please. And this is the last slide. So finally, we believe that no child should be prosecuted in military courts, which lack comprehensive fair trial and juvenile justice standards. We call on the government of Israel to respect international law and to end the detention of children under military laws and their prosecution in military courts. We also have like a list of recommendations in our report, which also includes practical safeguards that should be adopted to improve the protection of children currently held in detention. Our report also specifies recommendations for the international community, such as urging the government of Israel to end military detention and take steps to adopt practical safeguards to protect children. And this includes ensuring that children are detained only as a measure of last resort and for the shortest time possible, ending the systematic ill treatment of children, immediately end the practice of nighttime arrests, and ensure that in all other cases, arrest summons are used, and ensure that children have timely access to an independent lawyer of their choice, as well as parent or guardian, prior and during their interrogations. These are just examples of recommendations we have, but we do have others. I think Diana will share the report with you. Only when these changes have been made can damage to generations of Palestinian children be avoided. Thank you. Back to you, Diana.
Thank you so much. Yes, we will be, just to answer some of the questions that have come in the chat box, we will be recording this and putting it on the website. Lana, if you are happy, are you happy for us to put the slides up as well? Because people have said that they're fantastic. They are. Fantastic. So the slides will be up there as well. I will be posting the link to the Defenceless report in the chat box in a moment. The film will also be on there. And Lana has referred to an upcoming report that we will share with our subscribers as and when it comes out. I believe it's in production at the moment. So as soon as we can share it, we will share it with all of our subscribers as well. So I will take the rest of the questions later in the Q&A. Those were just a few points from your talk. Thank you so much, Lana. And I'll hand over to you now, Jude.
Good afternoon, everyone. Could I also say, Diana, that it would be helpful for you to share the 2012 report that we did, because although it is old, it certainly reflects, sadly, the continuum of all of these issues. And listening to Lana, very interesting as it was, very sadly, it is all of the same information, experiences, material, recommendations that we wrote about, heard about in 2011, some 11 years ago. And while I don't want to not be upbeat, I have to make it clear that this has been going on for such a very long time. There have been so many different people involved. You'll hear about Tariq's involvement and efforts that we've made with the UK government. However, what is positive is that reports and investigations are continuing and that there is still a momentum for change. Very briefly, because there is so much I could say about the delegation, I will just give a quick overview. In 2011, a delegation of family law and criminal law lawyers, solicitors and barristers went to the OPT and to parts of Israel to conduct an investigation into, or an evaluative analysis of, Israeli military law and practice as affecting Palestinian children. And even though at that stage, children over 16 were in fact not treated as adults within the offer military court, which did change, we were looking at children in the internationally accepted definition as those up to 18. After we had produced some recommendations, albeit not the full report, there was a change in Israel. One of the, I would say, only changes, and therefore an absolute tinkering with the system, to recognize that young people were up to the age of 18, and so are now dealt with in the military court. However, there is still a distinction, as Lana would be able to confirm, and Tariq, as to who is considered to be a juvenile, which is up to 14, and who is then considered to be a so-called young adult between 14 and 18. There is as much done as possible by the Israeli government, as far as I can see, to not only change and not only act on any of the recommendations that have been made, but to obfuscate and confuse and make the system as complex and complicated as it possibly can. Our reference point was to review, by reference to standards of international law and international children's rights. And in order to have what we hoped would be the maximum impact, we maintained as objective and independent a position and a delegation as possible, so that the Israeli government could not immediately discount or discredit what we were finding and what we were trying to say, and simply ignore us. Unfortunately, that is eventually many years on what has happened, but at the time we took the approach that we would listen and review, and that we would take information and details from all sides, if you like. And at that stage, given that it was headed by Baroness Patricia Scotland and had enormous publicity and knowledge of this delegation within government and within parliament, the initial Israeli state government response was to be relatively open, in the sense of allowing us access to a variety of different departments, courts, court officials, legal officials, judges, and so on. However, this didn't produce what clearly the Israeli government hoped would be a report that exonerated them or didn't criticize them. Notwithstanding that, we again took the approach in writing the report that we would simply report on what we had actually found, as opposed to taking a political stance, if you like, on either the occupation, the history, the state of Israel itself, and all the much wider political issues. Now, that was a particular stance that was taken at that time, and some people might or might not agree with it, but it was the way that the delegation thought was the best way to produce as detailed and as objective a report as possible. Having conducted this research, we concluded that on the basis solely of the legal differentials between the treatment of children, Palestinian children in the military system and children in the civil Israeli system, that there were a considerable number of breaches of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which Israel, of course, had appeared to, or certainly did sign up to in 1991. However, all obligations and rights and anything that pertain to that act and convention were routinely not adhered to, as I'm sure nobody will be surprised to hear, and were ignored. And the core articles that we considered to Israel to be in breach of were Article 2, discrimination, 3, the child's best interests, 37, premature resort to detention, 37C, non-separation from adults, D, prompt access to lawyer, use of shackles. We found that the transportation of child prisoners into Israel was in breach of Article 76 of the 4th Geneva Convention, and that failure to translate the various military orders into Hebrew was also a violation. And we ourselves also made a substantial number of recommendations, 40. And the core recommendations effectively mirror, although of course we could say that Save the Children mirrored us, but I'm not suggesting there's any kind of competition. Sadly, any recommendations from Save the Children and a variety of other organisations who've reported on this since have all been the same, and have all been about all of the areas of the criminal justice system, from pre-arrest, we started as pre-arrest, through interrogation, bail, plea bargaining, trial, sentencing and detention, and the complaints and monitoring system. Initially, there was some slight cause for optimism. The report was launched in 2012. There was a great deal of publicity and positive responses. Even the Israeli government didn't say anything negative initially. Even the Jewish Chronicle, who reported on the launch and attended, couldn't find anything in their reading of it to criticize it, because we had been so careful as to how we'd written it, and we'd reported on the facts and the law and nothing else. And initially there was some, I will put it in quotes, interest from the Israeli government as to further discussion and debate and dialogue with lawyers here, including the Attorney General, so at governmental level, about some of our key recommendations. And the one they were the most interested in to begin with was in fact the audio-visual recordings of interviews. And that was something quite substantial initially, because my view was, and that of the delegates, that notwithstanding that there were 40 odd other recommendations, if that was implemented, that would have the impact of potentially blowing wide apart the whole system. Because if interviews where so many threats and so much took place were recorded, then there could be no or very little space for the threats and intimidation and forcing of confessions from young people. And from the Israeli side, they claimed that it would assist them because they maintained, of course, that many of the allegations being made by young people about what they did in the interrogation process were made up. And so there was some initial interest because of self-interest, in fact, because they felt that this would mean that their apparent, clear and proper means of interrogating the young people would be exposed as the great system that they claimed it was. This eventually came to nothing. And after that, in 2014 and again in 2016, strenuous efforts were made to arrange and organize follow-up delegations to the OPT again and to Israel, with a view to looking at whether any recommendations had been implemented, even though we of course knew the answer really, but to do it officially and to discuss why. And on the first occasion, on both occasions, we had got as far, on occasion one, we had got as far as actually organizing everything, including all the meetings. The Israelis at that point had said that they would meet with us and make the various officials and organizations available to us again. And then they cancelled it at the last minute on the basis that they were, quote, too busy, unquote, being involved in Gaza. So that was cancelled. 2016, exactly the same thing happened. We had flights booked, everything was booked. We had all of the organizations. We had at that stage, I had managed with other people to get a number of other new people involved with the delegation, including Charlie Faulkner, who's in the House of Lords and who is the husband of one of the original members, and Keir Starmer. And in fact, there had been interest as well from some Liberal Tory MPs who we were keen to perhaps have one, because of course, most of the time the support in the House is not from that side of it. And literally within, I think, probably 4 or 5 days before we were due to fly, the Israelis pulled it. They said that they should not and would not meet with us, that our report had been entirely and unjustifiably critical, that if they let us in, all we would do is write another report criticizing them. They were not going to facilitate any kinds of meetings. And they didn't effectively say that they would ban us from entering the country, but we were left in a position where we had to make a decision as to whether, if we only went ahead and met Palestinian organizations and no other organizations, would we impact on the objectivity and independence of the first report by doing a follow-up report that only met with, quote, one side. I won't go into the details, but there was a difference of opinion within the delegation and people involved in it as to whether we should have gone or not, and had a large publicity campaign about the refusal of the Israeli government to meet with us. That was that, and here is not the forum to talk about that, but the result was that the delegation did not go ahead. Since then, I've been involved on and off. My involvement's been maintained, but it's on and off because of the lack of interest from the government. But Tariq and I have, at different occasions, met again with whoever the latest person in the FCO is. They've continued to express their interest in the issue, continue to claim that this is still a priority issue. I should add, for those that don't know, that the FCO funded the delegation, but on the basis that we were entirely independent. And that might seem like a slight contradiction in terms, but in fact, we were able to maintain our independence. They simply facilitated the report. We didn't have to run the contents of it by them beforehand or anything of that nature, and they were very hands-off. So that's why we continued to have these meetings. And but I'm afraid that, you know, events in England, change of government, Boris Johnson, etc., 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 has just meant that there has been very little interest from the FCO. Tariq might have something more up to date that will be more reassuring. I can assure everybody that myself and some of the core members of the delegation still wish to go and still to report back and still wish to continue this work, and that there will be many other people who want to do so. I think my 10 minutes is probably more than up, so I'll stop there, but obviously if there are questions, then I can answer them at the end.
Thank you so much, Jude. That's fantastic. We will be taking questions. So if anyone's got any questions, please do pop them in the chat box, and we are going to go through them, as many as we can, when we have finished with Tarek, who is now going to speak to us with some recommendations, I believe.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you, Jude, and thank you, Lana. My brief really is to talk about recommendations, but before I do so, first of all, I'd like to just thank Jude and Lana for their work over the years, and deeply impressed by their resilience and commitment to this really heavy issue. It fills me with a strong sense of despair whenever I focus on it, and part of that frustration is because the evidence is very clear of the harm that's being caused to children through Israel's military detention system. The international community is fully aware. Israel's fully aware. Israeli government, Israeli authorities are fully aware, and there is no change. And it's being left really to civil society to keep the issue alive, to keep the issue in the spotlight. And so I also would very much like to thank the Badil Project, Diana and Vincent, for organising this webinar and for helping sustain this issue. It needs it. So I'm going to try to be brief, but Diana, please come in, intervene when you want to, if I'm speaking too long and we need to go to the Q&A. First thing I'd like to say very simply is that from my perspective, from my perspective, this needs to be seen as both a major human rights problem and a significant child protection issue. It's the two sides of the same coin. The excellent approach taken by the UK lawyers and then by UNICEF, a year later, UNICEF produced a very similar report with essentially the same recommendations. Both very much took a legal and human rights perspective on the issue, and that's very important. And LPHR, that's our mandate, and we support that approach. But I have been left concerned that it's not really being seen as a child protection issue, and I would like more visibility on the fact that it is a significant child protection issue, and hopefully that may mobilize or generate more momentum behind reform and change. And Save Children's work on this and highlighting the child protection elements of this issue is extremely important. So with that being said, I'm going to very briefly take you through the UK government's approach to this issue over the last 11 years. And then before then going on to recommendations. The positive is that, as Jude has said, is that the UK government does treat this as, well, they rhetorically say that this is a priority issue. So that's a good starting point. And another positive is that Foreign Office officials, in my interaction with them, I'm convinced that they share our concerns, that they genuinely have frustration that there's no progress being made on this issue. But there's one thing Foreign Office officials being this way, and the broader UK government approach. And my concern is that the UK government has now essentially settled on a quiet diplomacy approach, which is fundamentally inappropriate when you're dealing with a major child protection issue. So one thing I'm very much going to suggest, and I might as well say it now, is that the UK government needs to fundamentally reassess its approach. It cannot take a quiet diplomacy approach to a major child protection issue. I'll elaborate on that a bit further. But in a sense, it's reached this position because it's been unsuccessful in its other approach. So I'll take you through that very briefly. So the first approach really was funding the UK lawyers, senior UK lawyers delegation that went out to Palestine to report on the issue. Jude was part of that delegation, and they came back with a fantastic report with 40 recommendations, and those recommendations have been unimplemented. Now, that was 2011-2012. As Jude has mentioned, a follow-up report was planned with the Foreign Office, with Foreign Office funding. Israeli authorities withdrew their support, essentially, for that follow-up report. The follow-up was supposed to report on the implementation of those recommendations. And it's very clear that the report would have said that essentially there's been no implementation. And it's very clear, it's very apparent that Israel did not want that criticism to come their way. So they essentially blocked off access. So that was 2014, then 2016, second rejection. In 2017, you may be aware or unaware that the UK government made an offer to the Israeli authorities for the Metropolitan Police to share expertise with Israeli counterparts on implementing regulations designed to protect the rights of children in detention. So the UK government's continue to take really a proactive approach, reaching out to the Israeli authorities, suggesting that there be an exchange, there be a dialogue between experts in Metropolitan Police with their Israeli counterparts to put in place proper safeguards for children. Israel refused that offer. Then in 2018, the UK government went before the UN Human Rights Council and made some recommendations to Israel as part of Israel's Universal Periodic Review. These included specific child rights recommendations, namely that there should be mandatory use of audiovisual recording in all interrogations of children, that there be a reduction in the use of single hand ties, that there be alternative to-night arrests, and that the Israeli authorities inform child detainees of their legal rights. So this was in a public forum at the UN Human Rights Council, making these necessary suggestions, recommendations to the Israeli authorities. Israel has not implemented them. And so we see the UK government in effect trying, but not succeeding. And it's based on that sort of public approach or failures. They've taken what can be called a private engagement or quiet diplomacy approach since then, in the hope that that may, if things don't work publicly, maybe they can be more successful with private engagement. This approach is not working at all. And in effect, it's actually worse than the previous approaches, because at least the previous approaches kept the issue in the spotlight, whereas the UK government's current approach essentially hides the issue, which is not good. As I said, it leaves it then incumbent on civil society to raise the issue. So that's the last 10 years of the UK government's approach. The international community, that can be extrapolated across the international community. There's been no success from the international community engaging with Israel, Israeli authorities. That also includes UNICEF, who, as I mentioned, produced a wonderful report in 2013. They had dialogue for at least 2 years with Israeli authorities on trying to make some progress, but essentially no progress was made. And UNICEF has largely gone quiet on the issue since 2015. So my suggestion, but not just mine, of course, many people who work in this field and follow this issue, is really that 10 years on from the UK lawyers report, think it's time for the UK government to have a fundamental reassessment of its approach to this issue. They should not settle on the quiet diplomacy / private engagement approach. That absolutely is not working. It's also clear that the incremental, or sort of the specific recommendations approach that was tried previously was not persuasive. It was not working as well in terms of persuading Israeli authorities to change the system. So I think it's time that UK government, not just UK government, parliamentarians as well, I think there should be a cross-party approach. They should be clear and unequivocal about the reality of the situation. My suggestion is that they adopt as their own position the 2013, the conclusion made by UNICEF in its March 2013 report. I'll quote it for you if you're unaware of it. So UNICEF in its landmark 2013 report on the issue of children in military detention said, the ill treatment of Palestinian children who come in contact with the military detention system appears to be widespread, systematic, and institutionalized throughout the process, from the moment of arrest until the child's prosecution and eventual conviction and sentencing. I think that language, the language of ill treatment, appears to be widespread, systematic, and institutionalized throughout the process, should be adopted by the UK government as its starting position on this issue. And they should be expressed, they should be clear and be unequivocal that that is their position, that they've adopted the UNICEF's position. Because the evidence is clear and overwhelming. Israel has not changed. They have not fundamentally reformed the Israeli military detention system. So with that being the starting position, I would then make reference to international principles to form the next position. So UN Convention on the Rights of the Child makes clear that the best interest of the child should be the primary consideration in all matters engaging with children. That is completely, Israel's military detention system does not comply with that fundamental principle, which is contained in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Secondly, the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention and has stated that, and Save the Children, this is their position as well, that military courts should not be used to try civilians, including children. It's a fundamental principle of international law. The UK government should adopt this as its starting position too. Military courts should not be used to try children. So based on all this, based on the overwhelming evidence that Israel has not fundamentally reformed its system as recommended by the UK lawyers and UNICEF and Save the Children and many other leading human rights organisations, I would suggest that the UK government considers calling for an immediate moratorium on the Israeli military authorities arresting, detaining and prosecuting Palestinian children until at least all the 40 recommendations made by the UK lawyers and UNICEF are accepted in full by the government of Israel. In essence, the system should be abolished because the system is harming children and no one should be calling for propping up that system. The call should be very clear and unequivocal that the system needs to be fundamentally reformed. And until then, Israeli authorities should not be arresting, detaining and trying children, Palestinian children in its military custodial system. That's a big ask, of course. So we also support Save the Children's more specific recommendations in respect of ending night arrest raids on family homes to arrest children. We agree with Save the Children that instead there should be a summons procedure, an arrest summons procedure. This was actually piloted by Israeli authorities in 2013 after the UNICEF report was published. As part of Israel's PR response to that report, they stated that we will issue a summons process or a summons procedure. In practice, it lasted, I think, just over a year. And in practice, summons were actually submitted to family homes at night. So family homes were still being targeted by Israeli authorities at night, but instead of arresting the child, they would issue the summons. But the traumatic effects of Israeli authorities making a nighttime raid on a home still continued. And of course, we agree with Save the Children that in all interrogations, there should be audio-visual recording, and the parents and the lawyer should be present. I think Jude will confirm, of course, that that's the case in the UK. It's quite standard. It defies belief why Israeli authorities would not implement the same for Palestinian children. Finally, and very finally, I think we need to be aware also that the ICC is now in play in respect of the opening of its investigation into the situation in Palestine. And I would actually recall the words of the UNICEF conclusion when they say that the military detention system provides for ill treatment, which appears widespread, systematic, and institutionalized throughout the process. The language of widespread and systematic takes you from an international criminal law perspective into the realm of possible crimes against humanity. And the new ICC prosecutor, Karim Khan, or fairly new now, he actually has he's elaborated his own sort of policy approach to certain issues. And one of them is that he's prioritizing, or appears to want to prioritize, apparent crimes against children. He's stated as much in relation to the Ukraine situation, and also in an interview last year that was published online, he said that essentially where crimes are affecting children, that's where he wants to go. And I think when it comes to Palestine, and when it comes to the West Bank, and when it comes to the widespread and systematic ill treatment being suffered by children, Palestinian children, I think that's where the investigators, should focus their attention. Okay, I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Tariq. We've had a bunch of questions come through. So if you do have any questions, please pop them in the chat box, and we will try to get through as many of them as we can. I just wanted to thank you all for joining us to talk about this issue, which is just completely harrowing. You think you know about it, and then you hear more of the facts, and you just realize how bad it is. And as Tariq said, this is just, we're asking what happens in the UK when a child is having some situation with the law. I mean, the outcry that would happen if this stuff happened in the UK, it just beggars belief that it can be going on. We're all still reeling as well from the terrible news about Shireen Abu Akleh this week. So yeah, it's been a very difficult time, and so I really appreciate you all joining me, and all of the attendees as well, who've come up with some amazing questions, as you can imagine. So the first, there's been a couple of questions which I'm going to direct at Lana, I think, although other two, if you have any comments on it, then please do jump in. We've got a lot of questions about what kind of crimes the children are being accused of, I should say. I mean, I think we would argue that it doesn't matter in terms of their treatment, but just out of curiosity, we've got from Magan Singodia, who's one of our trustees, why are the children throwing rocks? For example, is it related to the checkpoints and their treatment there? He says, I'm not justifying throwing of rocks, but it would be interesting to know the specific actions that are leading to these situations. And then we've got, for example, from Rodney Nicholson, what are the alleged charges made against these children and their families?
So the most common charges, as I've said, include throwing stones. On why our study didn't go on reasons, because I mean, guilty or innocent, it really is irrelevant to the treatment that children go through and are forced to experience. Children have, they should be just treated as children, which would include all the safeguards that entails as well. So whether guilty or innocent, it does mean as well that they are protected from ill treatment. But many research done as well by others showed that throwing stones usually doesn't cause harm by children. So I remember one research said that I think they've studied more than 80 cases with 3 causing harm, 1 to an individual and 2 to cars. And it's like the disproportionality as well maybe should be taken into account here, considering that the maximum penalty for throwing stones is 20 years as well. But again, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what they've done, whether they're innocent or guilty, or whether it's alleged or not, or what the causes are, because they are ill-treated no matter what, and they shouldn't be.
Thanks for that. We've got another question from Judy Cuniff. I would expect these experiences to often result in a diagnosis of PTSD. Is that the case? You talked about some of the repercussions on the children post-release. Is there any study into whether they are sort of officially diagnosed with PTSD, or what do they have?
Other studies would, there are other studies that said that. Ours didn't make the diagnosis. We spoke about the traumatic experiences they've had and suffered, but we didn't reach to make the actual diagnosis. But others did actually have studies and included that. Whether it's like a specific study or articles done by specific specialists. There is a specific MHPSS person like in the West Bank and in Jerusalem who works specifically with the children and writes a lot about the cases and the diagnosis she goes through. I can also, Diana, share with you a link of her writings if you would like to share that.
That would be great. I have posted the link that we are sharing the recording of this event once it's finished, as well as the different reports. Jude, yours from the delegation, as well as the Save the Children Defenceless report. And we will also put the new report out to all of our subscribers as well. So yes, Lana, that'd be great. And I will add that to the website as well.
Could I just add in terms of the PTSD issue, and obviously I don't know what the exact position is currently, but there certainly were various organizations working in the West Bank, limited because of funding, particularly with young men who had been in prison and been arrested, specifically around trauma and the issues. And I think YMCA, in fact, weirdly, was one of them. But again, that's through funding. So there is stuff out there. And certainly one of the things that we had wanted to do, but of course, we didn't even get to do our follow-up, was that we had thought about doing another delegation post the legal follow-up of social workers and child psychologists and various other people to then widen out what we were doing into the impact as well, because of course that's part of what happens with children within the youth justice system here. But given that we were blocked in going any further, you know, that didn't go any further. But there have been, you know, different delegations of probation officers and social workers who've gone out at different points from the UK, but that's obviously not quite what we're talking about here.
Yeah, YMCA are still providing services. They're one of our partners, and they provide psychosocial counseling to children and families, and they offer as well vocational trainings for them as an attempt to reintegrate them.
Another excellent organization there. We've got a comment from Wayne David. We actually, in the run-up to this event, shared his article on this subject that he had written last year, which is unfortunately still very relevant. But he said, excellent presentations, everyone. Soon after the new government in Israel was formed last year, the IDF announced that night raids and arrests of children doing those raids would stop. I take it that this never happened.
Well, Tariq and Lana might know more than me. I certainly wasn't even aware that that had been made as an announcement. And I read the latest report from Military Court Watch, who are on the ground. And I've read all of them from this year, from January up to now, and there is no change in anything. That has not changed, nor, and I think it was Tariq or Lana said, the directive all the way back in 2010 about hand ties is ignored. And again, yes, I would agree that with Tariq that, you know, the paltry attempt by the Israeli government to use summonses as an alternative to nighttime arrests, which was one of our key recommendations as well, lasted, I don't know how long it lasted, but not very long. It wasn't dealt with properly, and they came up with some excuse about why it didn't work, you know, and it was just pointless, really. So I don't know anything about this announcement. Perhaps Lana, being there, you know more, but certainly not been abided by as far as I'm aware.
Can one of you enlighten us with what the rationale is behind these nighttime arrests? Why is that even done?
Well, we were told when we challenged it that stripping everything away, that effectively the Palestinians couldn't be trusted to turn up, you know.
When they're summoned.
Yeah, if they were summoned, if they were notified of a police interview or of anything of that nature, the parents couldn't be trusted to bring their child. I mean, stripping everything away, that is what they were saying. So, and then in fact, I seem to remember, and Tariq might remember more, that from the limited research that was done by Military Court Watch and anyone else on the ground when they did do the summonses pilot, that of course people did turn up, that there wasn't, you know, even in their own terms, the Israelis couldn't say, oh, look, here is the evidence that we were claiming that, you know, nobody can be trusted. In fact, it was the opposite, because of course people would prefer to do that. And also it's not just about the nighttime raids and all the fear and intimidation and terror and everything that goes with that, but it's about giving the family more control over the actual so-called judicial process. And it means that, you know, there's more scope to involve a lawyer. And again, that would have been another kind of area that could have blown open quite a lot of all of the things that we were making recommendations about, because if the family came with a lawyer and a family member at an appointed time, there's your evidence that summonses would work. And also it gives a lot more control over, you know, what happens at the police station. You know, could I just make clear to the audience who I'm sure know, but what I didn't say, because I assume people knew, is that, you know, we weren't just looking at what was happening at Palestinian children in the military court system. We were comparing it to the Israeli civil system. And the Israeli civil system, under which Israeli children, and supposedly, but again, this actually doesn't happen, children in East Jerusalem are supposed to be treated under, is fairly much in line with the system here. It has the safeguards, etc., that exist for juvenile justice, but that is just for Israeli children. And that's the point, that, you know, not only everything that we say about what this military so-called justice system is, but that there is a massive differential, and that in and of itself is illegal, because an occupying power cannot provide differential legal systems for a population that they are an occupier of. And so that is an overarching breach, let alone all the little, not little, but all the smaller, you know, systemic breaches. So
thank you for that. That's really helped clarify that these child detainees are under the military courts, which are in charge of the West Bank, and that the Palestinian citizens of Israel in theory, and the Israeli children themselves are subject to a completely different system. We are coming to the end of time, and we've had a bunch of questions, but I'm going to finish on comments and a question from Jenny Tong, who I'm a big fan of. I'm okay admitting that. She says, Tariq, this is in response to you. Quiet diplomacy is government speak for doing nothing, which sadly is the case. She says, I tried and tried during my time in both houses, and we saw her try very hard, and was just dismissed as a troublemaker even by my own party, which is sad but true. And then she says, why do the UK government take no action even when they, even though they accept that there are these abuses happening? Why has the Israeli government got such power over our government? Why do we never impose sanctions? Don't know if any of you have any comments on this.
Well, sorry to be, I mean, does someone else want to speak? I completely agree with Jenny. What I would say going forward is that literally almost to the day, it is 10 years. It was June 2012. And I certainly will be talking to Tariq and perhaps, well, and with you as well, Diana, and any other partners about how we could use, you know, there always has to be a tagline. So let's use this as a tag. I could speak to Baroness Scotland and various other people and see whether there is any people within liberals within the current government. Obviously, there are other people within other parties that could get this re-raised as a parliamentary question, because in fact, there did used to be a lot of parliamentary questions about this. And so even, look, I know it's a pathetic little attempt. I get what people, I'm of the same view, but we have to get it into where the power is. And if we can get this re-raised in Parliament as to getting a parliamentary question that puts it right straight at the government to say, well, what is it that you're doing? You know, all of this description by Jenny and Tariq, we know this quiet diplomacy is effectively meaningless, and they need to be put on the spot to find out what they're doing. And we need to re-look at the FCO and any other possibilities. And if the IDF really have made that announcement, then let's take them at face value that this apparently means that they are considering issues around child treatment and look at whether there's some sort of opening there and something that we can do. But I also agree with Tariq that this has to be looked as a child protection issue. And I think the ICC is a real area as well. And I'll certainly be talking to Tariq about that and with colleagues at Diamonds, because we're already involved in some other legal stuff around the targeting of journalists and all of the stuff that's been happening in the West Bank. So I'll certainly look at whether there's stuff there as well.
Well, thank you so much. That is fascinating and depressing. It's the theme of all of our webinars, unfortunately. I am actually going to ask one more question because it focuses on the future a bit. So before I do, I just want to say thank you to you again for speaking, and to all the attendees. We've had about 150 people watch us live, and we will have many more people watch the recording. Can I ask everyone that is watching, share this recording with people, share the reports. Let's make some noise about this, because it's a very clear cut issue, I think, where some of them might be a bit harder to pull apart. This is quite clearly injustice towards children, which is pretty black and white when you think about it. So, so if this is the one issue, then please pick it up and share it as much as you can. So this question is about Ronald. It's from Ronald Mendel, comes along to our webinars, and he basically asks, what the how do these child detainees, prisoners, feel when they come out with regards to the Israeli officials and authority, and how does that affect their sort of future relations, really? Does anyone jump in?
I can start, maybe someone else can continue if they have anything to add. I know you said hopeful ending, so I'll try to end in a hopeful note. But generally speaking, children do struggle to reintegrate into society. It's just a complex social situation they're in, because first, the whole practice is normalized. Many children reported that they perceive themselves as heroes because of all of the celebrations that happen, but then the celebration ends, and most importantly, there is this sense of isolation. So it is difficult, but of course, with the support, which is always needed, even though difficult to receive, and sometimes they don't know about it. Not all children hear about it, not all parents know about it, but it's important to have the support, such as Jude spoke about, the YMCA and the so many other organizations that provide. Children do get rehabilitation and reintegration eventually through those services. And as I've said before, to end on a more hopeful note, they do think of their future and they're determined to have better future. They don't want to go work in construction sites. They want to study. They want to go back to their schools. They want to do different things. They want to do vocational trainings. They dream about having their own businesses. They dream about having big roles in their societies. So even with this really harsh experience that no child should be going through, they still have a really strong ambition and dreams for the future. Try to end on a hopeful note. Hopefully this would push everyone to work on really ending, pressuring Israel to end military detention. But yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Lots of comments of people really appreciating your presentations, the three of you. So I will be sharing the chat box with the speakers, so they will see all your comments, and really appreciate everyone that's come along. As you all know, we do these webinars, these monthly webinars for free at the Balfour Project. We would very much appreciate support. So I have posted the link a couple of times in the chat box, hint, hint, on becoming a friend of the Balfour Project. You become a friend if you sign up for any regular giving amount, either monthly or annual. Whatever you could spare, we would be eternally grateful, because it will enable us to carry on with these free webinars and our free conferences like the one that we have next week, which will touch on a lot of these issues and go into some more. It's focusing on abandoning Palestine, the final days of the British mandate, and how we got to where we are now, and what British responsibility might be, what it might look like, what our recommendations are. So please do join us next week if you can. Thank you again, speakers, you are fantastic. And thank you again, attendees.